I want to thank our wonderful friends at the library for their support of today's program. And we're very happy today to be hosting not one, but two Long Island authors, Ellen Meister and Daniel Paisner, who each have recently released new novels. Just a little bit of background about them. Ellen Meister is the author of several novels, including The Rooftop Party, Love Sold Separately, Dorothy Parker Drank Here, The Other Life, and others. Ellen is also an editor, book coach, ghostwriter, and frequent contributor to the Long Island Women magazine. She teaches creative writing at Long Island University, Hutton House Lectures, and previously at Hofstra University. Her latest novel is Take My Husband, which is a dark domestic comedy and will appeal to anyone who has been driven up a wall by their spouse. I think we can all relate. Beth Harbison, a New York Times bestselling author, describes it as a sharp, laugh-out-loud novel about a doting wife who has finally had enough, deeply funny and horribly familiar. Take My Husband is not to be missed. Ellen Meister is a modern-day Dorothy Parker, a real treasure. And Daniel Paisner, who's a fellow Port Washington resident, has recently released his latest novel, Balloon Dog, which tells the story of an art heist gone wrong and a series of midlife crises gone sideways. Laura Zigman, author of Separation Anxiety, describes it as darkly funny and painfully true. Balloon Dog proves that the unknowable road of life is best handled by experienced drivers, those who know only that twists are coming and trust that they'll be able to navigate them in their own imperfect way when they do. I'll also mention that Mr. Paisner is perhaps best known for his work as a best-selling ghostwriter, which includes over 70 titles and 17 New York Times bestsellers. New York Magazine once called Daniel Paisner the world's most prolific ghost. He has contributed with such celebrities as Whoopi Goldberg, Serena Williams, John Kasich, Denzel Washington, and Ron Darling, as well as longtime Port Washington resident Christina Chieger, co-author of the haunting and ultimately hopeful Holocaust memoir, The Girl in the Green Sweater. He's also the host of the popular podcast, As Told To, which features conversations with his fellow ghostwriters. So we're all in for a real treat today because in addition to discussing their new works, they each are going to interview each other about their creative process and give us some insight into what it's like to be an author here in 2022. So we will have time for Q&A. Please make sure to stick around. We do have book sales in the back, and the authors will be signing those at the end. So if you can, just please give a very warm welcome for Ellen Meister and Daniel Paisner.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and huge thanks to the Port Washington Library and the Friends of the Library for inviting us. It's been a few years since I've been here, and this has always been one of my favorite spots, one of my favorite libraries, so I'm thrilled to be here and delighted to be here with Dan.
Oh, aren't you kind, Ellen? I'm delighted to be here, too, with Ellen. I just finished Ellen's book last week, and I must tell you, buy a copy on the way out if you haven't read it already. It's really a whole lot of fun. And it is also darkly funny and painfully true, as mine is. If you go on Amazon and put in darkly funny, I think you'll find Ellen's book and my book up there. This is kind of a new format for us. We've never done anything like this before. We've done readings, we've given author talks, but we thought it would be interesting to kind of interview each other and talk about what we do. And I know Jeff said that we're going to open up the floor for questions later, but Ellen and I also want to invite you to interrupt us midstream if you have a compelling question to ask and want to redirect the conversation a little bit. So don't be shy. The lights are down, so make some noise. Jeff will find you and stick a microphone in your face. Just make sure, since he's going to all that trouble, that it's an intelligent question. You wouldn't want us to judge you.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here, and bear with us as we find our way, but this should be interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. People have asked me, do you know Dan well? Frankly, I don't. I mean, we've met a couple of times. I'm a huge fan. I think he writes like a rock star. And so I'm very excited to be asking him some questions. And when he gives me the answers, I'm going to be learning along with you. So I don't know how he's going to be answering these things. So I'm as excited about this as I hope you are. So should we just jump in?
Let's just jump right in. You want to start?
I'll start. I'd love to talk about, I think, I read Balloon Dog and I loved it. And I think it's such an inventive, wonderful story. And I would really like to know where the idea came from. How did this all come about?
As you know, some of these things just alight in your head as if from nowhere. And when people ask you later on, where'd you get the idea? You have no idea. But in this case, the story turns on the bungled theft of a larger-than-life industrial sculpture. In this case, it was a Jeff Koons balloon dog sculpture, which in the novel is lifted off the side of a mountain where it sits in front of a fabulous mountainside home in Park City, Utah. The idea came to me on Long Island. I was actually visiting a friend of mine, a brother of a friend of mine, who has a fabulous home in the Hamptons with a fabulous sculpture on his front lawn. And a bunch of guys came one Saturday morning while we were all still a little bit drunk and hungover. And they knocked on the door and they said, we're here for the Calder. Lo and behold, they've got a crane, they've got a flatbed, they've got 6 guys out front. We wave them on, we're taking selfies. We think it's the greatest thing in the world. Nobody thinks to call the owner of the home and see if these guys are legit. So in that, happily they were legit, so that's the end of that story. But in that moment, it occurred to me, what a great jumping off point for a story where you have an industrial size piece that's kind of lifted in plain sight. What happens then? And then the wheels were sort of set in motion.
That's fantastic. And I think that really speaks to how writers get their ideas. I mean, I always tell people as novelists, we're collectors, right? So we'll collect little impressions in everyday life to put into our books to add some verisimilitude. But we also collect these ideas. Things occur to us, and it could just go right past you, but sometimes it sticks around. And you say, maybe I should examine it. Maybe
it sticks around. It's like shit that gets stuck on your shoe, right? You're walking around with this idea. It might have been 2 or 3 years before I actually sat down to write that book.
And how did you change Calder to Koons? Was there a story behind that?
One of the themes I wanted to explore in this book, and it's one of the themes we can discuss here today as well, because I think it applies to both of our careers and the pursuit of our work, is who decides what has artistic merit? Who decides what's going to seep into the culture in a meaningful way and make noise? And I thought that this balloon dog sculpture, which has become sort of ubiquitous, there are many of them, I'm sure you've seen, they're like the smiley face of today's pop art world. Some of these Koons balloon dogs sell for $90 million.
I've seen that.
It's absurd to me. I don't understand it. And this is not a knock on Jeff Koons, who's a wonderful artist, who's built a brilliant career and made a name for himself. But as a struggling mid-list, widely underread author, I can't help but wonder, what do you got to do to get some attention?
Right.
The Calder didn't seem to do that for me. I wanted it to be a real piece, even though it's a fictional story. So somehow, after throwing some wet paper towels against the ceiling, that's what stuck.
I think it was a great choice because it's so vivid and so immediately recognizable.
It's immediately recognizable.
Yeah.
But then we have these other ideas. Your idea, for those of you who don't know the conceit of Ellen's book, I mean, the book turns on the notion that your main character, whose name is
Laurel Applebaum,
whose husband Doug is in turns out a nothing special traffic accident. She gets the call, and on her way to the hospital to see what's what, she imagines him gone. And she imagines that her life would be better, richer, more meaningful, very much more her own. Apologies to Ellen's husband, Mike, who's here in the front row. But it seems like you want to sort of the character wants to hasten his demise. So let me ask you the same question, and maybe Mike should leave the room for this. Where'd you get that idea?
Look, this was a book born of the pandemic, right? So, I mean, a lot of my women friends were complaining to me during lockdown, saying, I love my husband, but if I have to spend one more minute in lockdown with him, I'm going to have to decide who to kill, him or me. So I thought, well, that's very petty. But then soon enough, I kind of got to a similar place in the pandemic because, being locked out is a hard thing. But then my muse flew in the window and said, here's how you deal with that. Write a book about it, right? So I said, I don't know if I can. Sometimes I do grapple with my muse. I don't know if I can because it's awfully mean, right? This woman that wants to hasten her husband's demise. So I said, I can only make this happen if I could figure out a way to make the character relatable and sympathetic. And how do I do that? How do I put this sort of awful goal into this character's mind and take the reader on this journey? And one of the things that inspired me was Breaking Bad, right? Because Walter White, you know, don't get me wrong, if you haven't read the book, it is not as dark as Breaking Bad. There's no meth and, you know, there's no violence in the book. But, you know, Walter White was obviously an everyman. Who here has seen Breaking Bad? Does everybody, like most people have seen Breaking Bad. So Walter White is an everyman who winds up taking like a small step, you know, toward the abyss, toward immorality. And every little step he takes makes it sort of easier to take the next step and the next step. And each step that he takes, you can't believe that he did that and that he could go any further, and that he does. So that, and I'm not saying I based it on that, but it influenced me in developing this character and developing this book. I mean, I wound up going in obviously a very different direction, and I don't want to give anything away, but let's just say there's no redemption in Breaking Bad.
No, and there is here, but I was, wondering that as I was reading this, because you have this very likable character at the helm of your story, and you want your readers to throw in with her and to root for her and to trust in her, and yet she's plotting, on offing her husband, and she's aided and abetted in this wishful thinking by another character or two in the book. And how do you root for these people? And as a novelist, you're puppeteering these scenes. I'm sure that had to be in the forefront of your thinking, because if they're dastardly, evil, despicable folks, people are going to set the book down.
Right. I had to figure out who this woman was and how she could get to this point. And I had to create somebody who had a very traditional marriage. Mm-hmm. And by traditional, I mean that she takes care of her. She's her husband's caretaker. He does basically nothing for himself. So who would this woman be who would have this marriage that's kind of a throwback? Modern woman is not going to have this marriage where she, butters her husband's toast and does absolutely everything. So I had to think about who she was and how she got to this point where she is that kind of a caretaker for her husband.
You did a great expositional thing to launch your book, which I thought was a really fine choice that you made. While this character, Laurel, is frantically leaving her job, she works at a Trader Joe's. Money's a little tight in this household. Doug, the husband, is out of work, seems disinclined to look for work. And as she's imagining all these worst case scenarios that she's hoping for on the way to the hospital to answer this emergency call, thinking she's going to find her husband dead, she walks into the emergency room, finds him very much alive. And the first thing out of her husband's mouth when the character walks into the room is, "Did you bring a snack?"
Yeah.
So right away, you get who this is, you get the tug and pull and what's wrong in that relationship, and you're able to set that story in motion in such a way that you do give a shit about this character, Laurel.
Thank you.
Even though she's imagining the worst. So that one line, I thought, did a lot of important business for you.
Thanks. That was fun when I got to that. I want to switch around and talk to you about your characters.
Yes, ma'am.
Because I love the characters in this book. Dan, one thing that we have in common as writers, besides both being Long Island writers, both being novelists, we both like to employ humor in our books. We both seem to be very comfortable writing in, and this may be a little bit esoteric, but we both are very comfortable writing in a very close third person. Mm-hmm. The third person that feels like first person. So you have several points of view, and they're all close third person. And you have just wonderful characters. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, particularly about Harrison Clott, who I think I told you reminds me of a Richard Russo character, which for me, that's a big compliment. I'm a huge Richard Russo fan. So I want to know how did Harrison come about? And you could talk about Lem and Sherry Braverman. And
well, Harrison Clott, one of the two protagonists really at the heart of this novel, is a frustrated middle-aged novelist who made a splash with his first novel and made less of a splash with his next one, and the subsequent ones just weren't coming. So he makes a living as a writer of press releases for a local plastic surgeon and seasonal menus for local, craft restaurants in his community. Not really much of a writer, not really much of a living, but he's holding on to what he can of this identity that really shaped him as a younger man. So he kind of gets caught in the swirl here. How I came up with him is, people say write what you know. I wouldn't say I haven't been asked to write a seasonal menu yet. I'm available if we have any chefs out here in the audience. But, my books have been, this is something else we need to talk about too. I mean, your books are published by big time houses. I know you've shared recently that you're frustrated with the sales and the response of this one, and you're thinking of making a pivot. My first novel, when I was a young guy, was published by Hutton. My next book was published by Bonus Books, two big houses. The next book by a smaller indie house, and this book by a smaller indie house still. So I shared that frustration with this character, Harrison Clott. The other protagonist, the bad guy, who's an art mover, who knows a little bit about how this stuff is collected and admired and then ultimately squirreled away by people of means and people who decide what pieces of art we're going to cherish and value and hold dear. He gets this notion in his head because he wants more out of his life. So I wanted to put these two folks, sort of get them lock heads a little bit and think about how they can maybe move their lives forward in a new direction.
You did it masterfully. I mean, they were such engaging characters. Very different. They weren't, I mean, that was said, it reminded me of Richard Russo. I don't think there's anything derivative here. I think your characters and the story are incredibly original. When you come up with these ideas, I mean, it sounds like, and I don't know if this is always the case, it sounds like for this particular book, certainly the story idea came before the characters. Is that usually how it happens? And if so, how do you decide what characters to put into the story?
Well, in this case, the story idea, the hook for the story came into play alongside the emergence of these characters. Once I knew this world that I wanted to put them into, and once I knew this art heist scenario, at that point I had no idea what was going to happen next. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm a struggling mid-list, widely underread author. I don't like to work from an outline. So
that was one of my questions. Yeah.
I don't want to write the book to the end in my head until I see where the characters take me. In your case, I was going to ask you the same thing. I mean, you start off with a woman who wants to kill her husband, who imagines her life will be better if he's gone. Lo and behold, he's alive and well. Did you know where that was going to take you, or were you along for the ride with the reader?
I sort of knew, when authors have this conversation about whether they outline or not, they use the terms whether they're plotters or pantsers, meaning they write by the seat of the pants, or they carefully map out the plot. And I contend that most authors are sort of a combination. It's more like you might lean toward being a pantser, and I might lean toward being a plotter. But I think they were all sort of a combination. In my particular case, I do think story is hard. That's the hardest part for me. Developing characters, coming up with an idea, that's the fun part. Putting the characters in a scene, writing the scene, I love that part. Figuring out what's going to happen from beginning to end, for me, that's where the hard work is. And so I do like to spend a lot of time thinking about the structure of the story before I begin. It's not to say it's not going to change, but I do think about who my main character is, what their goal is, what they hope to accomplish by the end of the story. Because I do think, I think of a book as sort of a contract between the writer and the reader, that I'm taking you on a journey and I'm going to deliver you someplace. So I need to think about what my character's goal is, whether or not they achieve their goal, and always what their character arc is going to be.
And do you think about that for all your characters or just your principals? Because
the principals.
You've got a lot of stuff going on here in this book.
The principals. I don't do it for every character. Certainly the main character, and that's gonna drive everything else. So I do start out with some sort of a structure. And it all happens almost like this with every single book that I write. I always decide I'm going to outline this really carefully, make it so much easier to write the book. And what usually happens is that I start out great guns like that, and I think, all right, I know where I'm going to begin, and I sort of know where I'm going to end, because I know whether my character achieves their goal or not. Then I work really hard to find like a midpoint to work toward, something that's going to increase the stakes. And that's my loose structure, right? And it's all that pesky stuff in the middle that's a problem. So I usually kind of know the beginning, kind of know the end, and try to get an idea for what happens right at the midpoint. And then when I say to myself, okay, now what else is going to happen and what's going to get in my character's way, I usually get stuck at that point and I say, I can't do it until I find my character's voice and figure out a little bit more about who my character is and what the pace of this book is going to be. And at that point, I usually stop outlining and I write 3 or 4 chapters. Then I go back to outlining. So it is kind of a back and forth. And even if I get a fairly good structure going, it's never written in stone. Because, and this is, what Dan was talking about with his characters, when you start out, you think you have an idea who your characters are, but as you write the book, you get to know them better and better and better.
They announce themselves.
Right.
And
then sometimes, so then you'll find yourself in chapter 17, and the thing that you thought they were going to say or do doesn't feel natural anymore. And at that point, well, what do? I say you have to stay true to the character. Always have to stay true to the character. So at that point, you have to revise the outline. So that's the way I tend to structure. It's a lot of back and forth. Now, I suspect, even though you say you're sort of flying by the seat of your pants, there's somewhere in your head that you have some sort of loose structure in something that you're writing.
Well, I knew I wanted these bad guys to lift the sculpture. I knew I wanted Harrison Klott somehow to be in the home when he did so, so that he was taking this Koons artwork in plain sight. I didn't quite know how they would meet, and then I didn't quite know how these other characters who populate the story would play into the overall themes of the book. So I kind of let myself float along there. I don't always think of the reader first. Perhaps I should. I try to amuse myself. And I figure if I'm having a good time, maybe some other people will come along with me. And if they don't, you know what? I have this other job, my day job as a writer, as a ghostwriter. It's not my livelihood.
Right.
Which is one of the things I want to lean into before we run out of time today. I mean, we both live on Long Island. It's not an easy place to live and stay ahead of your bills. The book business is difficult. You do a bunch of other things. You ghostwrite,
I teach.
Yeah. I think we'd make different choices creatively if we depended on those choices commercially, right? I've given myself the luxury of making choices that amuse myself.
Right.
And if I was thinking differently, or strategically, I might make different choices. I might go at it differently.
Well, it's interesting because I often think that these ideas that amuse me so much are going to be more commercial than they are. So when I came up with the idea for going back 2 books before this, I came up with the idea for a character who was a woman who, an actress who got a job as a host at the shopping channel, right? And it was a very fish out of water kind of story because she wasn't the kind of woman who would get that job.
This was the Rooftop Party.
Yeah, even before that, Love Sold Separately.
Oh, she was in that too?
There were 2 books with that same character. And this was one of those things, as we were talking about what comes first, character or story. And in that instance, I had this idea for a character. I didn't have a story. And I kind of let it go. But it was swimming around in there. And all of a sudden one day I went, a murder mystery at the shopping channel, right? So now I had a story. And I thought, this is going to be the most commercial book I've ever written. I mean, a murder mystery, the shopping channel, it's sexy, it's funny, it's got a murder mystery. People love all that stuff, right? Well, then my agent went to sell it as a murder mystery, and it turned out there was no room on the murder mystery shelf for this book because it didn't fit any of the murder mystery categories, right? It wasn't a thriller, it wasn't a procedural. And I had an amateur sleuth, which is usual. I don't know, are there any cozy mystery readers here? It looks like there aren't. But there's a category called a cozy mystery with an amateur sleuth, so I assume that's what it was. But a cozy mystery, it turns out, is set in a small town, is extremely G-rated, usually has some adorable craft like, baking or knitting or something at its core. And, my book was like sex, drugs, rock and roll and took place in New York City. So there was no place on the mystery shelf for it. So my agent, God bless her, did find a publisher for it, but the publisher decided to publish it as a rom-com with a mystery element. So, even when I'm trying to write something that I think is very commercial, it's very hard to gauge that.
It really is. And publishers seem to know less and less about what they want and what to do with something once they have it in hand.
Right. Right.
I had a book, my last book was, for lack of a better description, it was a baseball novel. It was sort of a passive-aggressive time travel, supernatural, magical realism piece that centered on the imagined return of the specter of this old-time baseball player. And so there was it was mostly a novel about contemporary characters, but it was connected to a centuries-old baseball player who had a meaningful thread that we were tugging on here. And one publisher read this book and admired this book and said, you should change this to soccer. Soccer's more popular. We'll sell more books if this was about soccer. Nobody cares about baseball. So, publishers really don't know what they want or how to slot things. And you say there's no room on the bookshelf for the book that you wrote. Make a bigger bookshelf.
Right, right. And an interesting aside, again, getting into the weeds on publishing. When I started in this business, a book gets sold, the person who works at the publishing company who reads the manuscript and buys the book, the one that the agent sends it to, is an acquiring editor. And the acquiring editor would have to take the book to the marketing department and pitch it. And then the marketing department would have to say yes or no, or how much can we afford, how much do we think this is going to sell? And then they come up with some crazy, calculation of how much of an advance to offer the author. But as the years have gone by, the role of the acquiring editor or the influence has gone down and down and down, and the influence of the marketing department has gone up and up and up. So if you want to sell something to a major publisher, it's really the marketing folks who are going to ultimately be making that decision now. So that's, you talk about publishing being where art and commerce meet, commerce is kind of taking over the art.
It's frustrating. It's maddening. We talked about this the other day on the phone. We were kind of trying to figure out where to go with this. This book was sent out. I'm represented by the William Morris Endeavor Agency. It's a big-time literary agency. They sent this book to the top literary editors in the city. Most people just say pass. But out of the 25 or 30 rejections that we got, maybe 8 or 10 of them took the time to weigh in and to send a note back to my agent saying, gee, I wish we could find a way to publish this. I love the book. Paisner has no platform. Paisner's last book sold abysmally or not at all. He's too old. So there were all these other factors. If this had been my first book, and if I had been a dashing 40-year-old instead of a dashing 60-something-year-old, maybe this book would have had a different fate, and it wouldn't have wound up in the hands of this wonderful indie press in Virginia, and it could have been put out into the world by a Simon & Schuster. You've had some of the same frustration. You said the other day you were even thinking of maybe writing under a pseudonym and starting fresh.
Yeah. And I had a similar experience with Love Sold Separately, which is originally called Kitty Kitty Bang Bang, because like I said, it was supposed to be
I like that title.
I love the title. And a mystery editor wrote to my agent and said, I'm gutted that I can't make Ellen an offer on this. Gutted. She loved the book. The marketing department said, we don't know how to sell this book. So and a lot of authors wind up doing this, if they can't get a publishing contract because these offers are made based on the sales, you're only as good as the sales of your last book, then people write under a pseudonym and market the book as a debut author. And they write it under a pseudonym. And it's a little kooky because you say, well, if you're a mid-list author, shouldn't that be enough? I mean, wouldn't a publisher prefer a medium amount of fans to no fans? And they actually don't. They really like the excitement of a quote-unquote debut author, even if you're just a pretend debut author. So, you could have not been Daniel Paisner. You could have been somebody else, and maybe Balloon Dog would have sold to Simon & Schuster,
Who knows? We'll
Who
never
knows?
know, will we?
Yeah, yeah.
But so the advice to you young writers out there, I see a lot of young writers
Yeah.
out there, is, make sure you have a day job.
Yeah.
And change your name.
Yeah, yeah.
Any questions? Anybody want to throw anything at us? We have a question towards the back over there.
Yeah, on this side.
Coming around with the mic.
After J.K. Rowling had the huge success with the Harry Potter books, she started writing other books under a pseudonym. What the reason was for that? I mean, it eventually came out that it was.
Yeah,
J.K.
Robert
Rowling,
Galbraith,
but-
right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's not unusual that you see somebody at that level of fabulous success try something new under a different name, because readers are conditioned to bring some preconceived notions into a project, and it's entirely possible that her goal there was to have people look at her material with a fresh eye. I don't have
Yeah.
any firsthand knowledge
Yeah.
of that, but I would imagine
Yeah.
that was the case.
I think she also wanted to see if it was just her name that was pulling her along, or if she could write something fresh and get a following. It didn't wind up working out that way because somebody at the publishing company spilled the beans, which they weren't supposed to do. So word got out before that book hit the shelves, I think, that it was her.
So she was outed, but that's a
Yeah.
time-honored literary tradition
Yeah.
of writing as someone else in order to get a proper hearing, either for the work or for yourself.
Another question here. This is great, isn't this, everybody?
You're like Phil Donahue.
Yeah.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Ivan.
You're both experienced pros. Have any of you ever tried writing a screenplay?
I'll let Ellen field that
Funny
one.
you should ask. So I am currently trying to sell Take My Husband as a TV series. And in the past, when my agent felt that my book could, any particular one of my books could work as a movie or a series, she would go to a sub-agent who specialized in selling books to film. And I had absolutely nothing to do with the process. I wouldn't know when it was being pitched, if it was being pitched, if there was interest, if there wasn't interest, completely out of the process. I did have a little luck at one point when one of my books, The Other Life, was optioned by HBO. I had a really exciting year thinking I was going to have a TV series, but the option wasn't picked up. And it was at a big name in HBO too. With this book, I really wanted to be way more involved. I didn't want to just sit back and rely on somebody else to try to sell it. I really wanted to be very, very aggressive about it. And I didn't know a lot about how to go about it, but I understood you needed to create something called a pitch deck, which is almost like a slideshow presentation about the book to promote it to Hollywood, because people in Hollywood don't really read, they like pictures. So I found some partners who are producers, and they're in the publishing industry, friends of mine, who were sort of coaching me along in the process, and sort of one thing led to another, and we decided to become partners in trying to sell this as a TV series. So together we put together a pitch deck, and then with my writing partner, we wrote a pilot script, and their names are Ariel Eckstadt and David Henry Sterry, and they've been sending the book out, and we got a very exciting bite. I can't really talk about it too much, and I still, everything is always a long shot, but a very major studio read the pilot and loved it and invited us to pitch series, the season 1 and beyond of the series, which we recently did. And the process is still ongoing. They had some notes, and we're seeing if we could address it and see if it could sell. And if it can't sell to them, we'll just keep going and try to sell it to somebody else, because there's been some interest from players here and there. So that's been pretty exciting. You never know. The stuff is really hard to do. This is the brass ring that everybody wants because, as we've been discussing, there's definitely not a whole lot of money in publishing for mid-list authors. But if you could get, a movie or a TV series, that is really the brass
Well,
ring.
let's talk about why
So-
it's the brass ring that everybody wants, because I imagine, though, at the end of the day, let's flash forward to the happy outcome here. HBO picks up your series, Netflix picks up your series, you become a household name, your next book is in demand. You're going to go out and write your next book as a novel on your own.
That's right.
Answering to nobody,
That's
not
right.
doing it by committee, in collaboration with all these other suits or studio
Then I
people.
get to be a diva.
You get to be a diva.
That's my goal.
But to me, the end game is this, what
Yeah.
we're doing. And,
Yeah.
People say, and I know this is not how you meant the question, but often I'll get, when somebody reads one of my books, they say, oh, this is great, it should be a screenplay, as though that's somehow a higher art form.
Yeah.
I don't see it that way. I see the novel is the thing, as far as I'm concerned. I'd love it if more people read the novel, and if a movie meant more people would find it, then I'm a happy camper. But it wouldn't change my MO.
Right.
So yes, it's the brass ring, but let's be clear, at least among ourselves here, what that means. It doesn't mean you're going to become a hot shit TV executive.
Right.
You're still going to be a Long Island novelist.
Right.
Right.
But just hopefully a more successful Long Island novelist. And
Right.
that's, right, because once that happens, then you're right. You get to you get to be the property that they want.
Right. I
And
mean,
you
what
don't
I
have to
love,
go begging the publishers to take you on.
what I love about the way I do this is you don't have to ask anybody's permission.
Yeah.
You don't have to vet your ideas. You just wake up in the morning and you pour yourself a cup of coffee and you dust off your desk and you sit down and you do whatever the hell
That's
you
right.
want that day. And you let your work take you wherever it will. And when you're working in Hollywood or you're working in television, you have to answer to people,
You sure do, yeah.
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 And as my lovely spouse, who I do not want to kill off, will tell you, I don't work well with others.
But I would add,
Yes.
I have never seen you dust off. And I too wish you were a 40-year-old person.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad we called you out here.
The other question?
Thanks. Hello? Yeah, you kind of started to address it, but and you thought you don't work well with others, but I was going to ask about, maybe it's changed over time in your career for both of you, and you're talking about the motive. Initially, if you are writing a book, you envision it as a movie, the brass ring, but how has working with an editor, or has in your time, it may have changed from an earlier age, and as well in the industry, as they influence the publishing of a book and the decisions that get made when you initially pitch or if you're working on it, and is that collaborative? And you kind of said you don't want to work. I don't know what that means in terms of the editor and the publisher dictating how you should drive the story, considering marketing, et cetera, your ultimate intention to maybe make it a movie, things like that. And that maybe you can address that individually over your career, and maybe as well as the industry, and how has that changed? You talked about how the influence of the marketer is no longer, or is much higher than it used to be, but could you address like the editorial process and how that interacts with your writing process?
Well, I'll take that first. I mean, I think publishing is like any other business. There are talented folks toiling away in publishing houses, and there are brutally untalented folks who are toiling away in publishing houses. I'm thrilled when I have the chance to work with a gifted editor who can make my work better. I dread having to work with editors who simply want to put their fingerprints on my work and just make it different so they can sort of justify their having been there. So, when it feels to me like my wheels are being spun and the work isn't growing on the back of that collaboration, I resist. I've been at it long enough to have a pretty good sense of where I want to go with stuff, and I could see I'm open enough to input from somebody if they have something of value to add. I don't assume just because they're sitting on that side of the desk that they do have value to add, because I've been mightily disappointed over the years. Ellen, how do you feel?
Yeah. I think that I've been fortunate in the most of the editors I've had. I really have felt, not that I always agreed with them, but that they had the best interest of the book was sort of paramount to them. And you know, the way it works with an editor at your publishing house is you turn in the manuscript, and then they send you notes, and they're developmental notes, and they're usually, you know, a good editor will not tell you what to do. A good editor will point out the weaknesses and let the author figure out how to address them. And that's my favorite types of notes to get. And sometimes, and it's kind of interesting, and sometimes I will push back a little because I won't agree necessarily. But sometimes what happens is they'll identify something as a weak point, and what I'll realize is I understand what their problem is, but it's not what they think it is. And I'll say, if I shore up this, then this works. And there's give and take. I mean, I've never really come to blows with an editor about, you know, they want the book to go one way and I want the book to go another way. I mean, I probably had more disagreements on this book with the editorial direction than most, which is understandable, because this book is, you know, pretty out there. It's a sort of a crazy story.
Wasn't the editor, I read a piece that you gave an interview, who suggested this title, that you went in with another title?
I suggested the title, but I actually like this title better. I went in with the title Dear Husband, which I never loved.
Right.
But it was the only thing I could think of. And I wasn't going to make myself crazy, because I know they usually reject my titles anyway. But they asked me for a list of titles. And Take My Husband was on the list that I gave them, and they chose that.
Okay, so they pushed you to come up with something
else. Yeah,
else.
they pushed me to come up with more titles. And when we hit that, we knew that we got the right title. But and I'm also fortunate that my agent is a good developmental editor and will offer input. But I really don't ever take editorial input if I feel it's not right. If I feel it's going to make the book weaker and not stronger, I don't do it. But I do try to work hand in hand with the editor to try to figure out how to, you know, solve what their problems are with the book.
Interestingly, I get the most useful editorial commentary from the nonfiction books that I do as a ghostwriter. Jeff mentioned earlier that I work with a lot of celebrities, actors, and athletes, helping them to write their stories. And when those books are being shepherded through the publishing houses, those are usually guided by the best of the best, because very often, if it's a major star, it represents a major investment of their resources. You know, they're shelling out shekels, you know, pittance to me. So very often I'll be working with somebody who's junior. But if I'm working on Whoopi Goldberg's book and they've paid $6 million for that book, they're going to make sure that their best and brightest, it's all hands on deck. And very often they have something of value, and they kind of have a clear idea of what they want this book to be. Even though you're not looking at story points, we're writing about a lived experience, we know what's happened, really has to do with structure and pace and tone and all that sort of stuff. But those comments I find enormously helpful.
So just before we take the next question here, I just got to say, this is really terrific. I feel like we're getting a wonderful behind-the-scenes view of being an author in this contemporary time.
Henry Miller said one time that 99% of writing is reading. So my question is, A, do you agree with that? And B, what other kinds of things do you read? Do you tend to read the types of the genres of what you write, or do you go somewhere else to read?
Good question, Don.
It is a good question. I read across the spectrum, and I do think that's important. I mean, of course, there are things I prefer. You know, I'm not like necessarily a big science fiction fan, so not going to read science fiction. But I read literary fiction, and I read women's fiction, and I read some thrillers, and I read mysteries. And I honestly do feel like I learn something from every single book that I read. Even if it's learning in the negative, like if this author does something that I didn't like, I say, oh, I have to remember not to do that. But I really, but sometimes it's the tiniest things, you know, the way an author handles a transition in time, or, you know, some small thing, but I will learn something from everything I read. So I agree with that. I think reading is vitally important. And when I have some of my writing students say, well, I don't like to read much, I say, you know, it's imperative. It's part of the process. You really have to read like crazy. What's your take on it?
I read pretty widely. I read a lot of celebrity memoir stuff because of that work that I do. I'm curious about the choices people make, what they choose to share in these pages, what dark truths they maybe keep for themselves. I'm curious if they've worked with a collaborator, how he or she is able to capture their voice and bring it across on the page. So I read those books for craft and sort of insights on how I could do my job better. But I read a lot of fiction. I read contemporary fiction, a lot of literary fiction. I've lately started to read some old classics that I haven't read in a long time. I think it keeps me thinking, and I like to see, like reading Ellen's book, that little tidbit that I offered earlier in this talk, where the main character goes and finds her husband still alive and well, and he says, do you bring a snack? I made a little note to myself. I said, I'm going to steal that. Not that line, but the ability to set a story in motion with a very quick exchange between two characters that know each other intimately, that immediately signals to the characters and also to the reader who they are and what they're about and what's about to happen. And to look for those little kernels and those little pivot points that I can telegraph in a very succinct way to my readers. It did a whole lot of business for her. And I thought, okay, I'm going to look for something like that the next time I'm looking at a similar turn
That's
of plot.
exactly what I mean when I say I learned something from everything. There's always at least some little nugget, some tidbit you can get from it. Reading is so important.
And then the inverse of that is also true. You know, I read stuff that infuriates me. And
Yeah.
I said, how the hell can somebody make this choice? How the hell can an editor allow that writer to make that
Yes.
choice and let it stand? And
Yeah.
for the first time in my life, I've never really done this before. I now set books down. If they're not doing it for me, I don't
Yeah.
finish it. I used to think that was a kind of sacrilege. I would never dishonor the work of a writer in this way. But you know what? Life is short. There are a lot of books to read. And if it looks like crap on page 32, it's going to be crap on page 332.
I have another question that I wanted to get to before we end here, because
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to this.
Go ahead.
How did you get into writing to begin with? How did your career get started?
I had a teacher. I grew up not far from here. I went to Wheatley High School, and I had a teacher in 8th or 9th grade who encouraged me. Writing was something I'd always done. Writing had always come easily to me. I wanted to be a journalist when I was a kid. I had a pal whose mom was a school librarian here in Port Washington, actually. And she encouraged us. We wrote like a little neighborhood newspaper, who didn't get their mail the right time today when we were 6 or 7 or 8 years old. But this one teacher, when I was at Wheatley, encouraged me. And she said, you're really good at this. Have you ever thought about being a writer? No, I hadn't. But you know what? It came easily to me. I was kind of lazy. And I said, okay, if Mrs. Bradley thinks I should be a writer, then I'll be a writer. I didn't have anything to say.
So did you go to J school, or were you an English major? Or?
I was an English major. And when I looked at schools, I've had kids who've gone to college. 2 of them looked at schools through an athletic lens. They were recruited by coaches. So they went and visited the teams. Other people have kids, their kids want to be pre-med. I looked at the campus newspapers. And when I went and looked at schools, I spent a night with the newspaper as it was being put to bed and think, oh, can I hang out with these people? Can I do that? So I went to Tufts University because I thought I could edit that paper. That would be fine. Then I went to J school after that. How about you? Where did this bug come from with you?
Well, I got the bug, in high school. I mean, when I was a young kid, a little girl, I thought I wanted to be an actor. And again, it was like a simple line from a teacher who said, it was even, sort of a begrudging compliment, and then it just something clicked. And I said, oh, right, this is what I do. This is it, not the other thing. This is it. It was like, as soon as the idea was put into my head, I knew. And I was an English major in college, and then I went into advertising. I was writing ad copy, and I felt like I was sort of scratching my creative itch through writing advertising copy, which, by the way, I really liked being a copywriter. I still like writing copy. It's kind of easy and it's kind of fun for me. But I think it worked in 2 ways. I think it sort of helped me hone my skills, because if you're writing brochures, right, people read it over the garbage, right? You have to sort of catch them before they let it go and into the trash. So I really learned how to capture a reader's attention. That was sort of drummed into me. But on the other hand, it allowed me to keep procrastinating on my dream of being a novelist, which I graduated college wanting to be a novelist, but I was able to tell people, well, I'm a writer. I write, and order now and, get 2 for 1 or whatever. But I was able to tell myself I was a writer, and I kept procrastinating. And I didn't really get serious about writing a novel till, I was in my 40s, and I had a mortality moment, and I realized, yikes, this ride doesn't go on forever.
And do you always have one going, or do you have one percolating?
I
Or
didn't. I had no idea what I wanted to write about. I just said, oh my dear God, I'm just going to wake up one day and I'm going to be 80, 90, 100 years old. And I'm going to say, damn, I never took that shot that I wanted to do my whole life. And you better do it now, because, we just don't know how short this ride is going to be. And it really literally was a mortality moment. And it just got me off my butt, and I started working on my first novel. 3 little kids. The only time I had to do it was at 5 in the morning before the kids got up. And I wrote my first novel between the hours of 5 and 7 a.m. And I still get up at 5 a.m. to write.
that's when all the good stuff happens. So
Yeah.
what do you teach now? You teach creative, you teach
I teach creative
fiction.
writing.
So your students, where do they get this bug from? Do they come to you late in life and they say, okay, this is something
Yes.
I've always wanted to do, or you get young
Yes.
people who want to fashion a career?
I've been
Both.
teaching, I teach continuing education, right? I'm not a college professor. I've been teaching. So a lot of my students are retired people who wanted to write their whole lives, and now that they finally have time are going for it. I would say that's who many of my students are. So, I'm teaching privately, and, when the pandemic hit, I haven't been back to LIU Post. So I probably will go back eventually. But I also met, students at Hofstra. But that's who most of them are. And it's been a joy and an honor helping people achieve their dreams and become better writers. And I think it's made me a better writer, because, teaching, you have to deconstruct for your students what works and what doesn't in their writing, and deconstruct. Do I know how I do what I do? I don't always, but you have to learn to deconstruct it and figure out what you're doing, and it helps me be a stronger writer.
Well, you're doing something right. I tell people, you have the kind of career that I want as a novelist.
Says the guy who's written, 70,
Well, yeah, but those are not my books.
Yeah.
I've written 60 books for other people and,
Yeah.
and 10 for myself. And what I want out of this transaction, what is my idea of success for Balloon Dog? By the way, you should check out today's Newsday. There's a glowing review of Ellen's book in today's Newsday. So they're singing her praises, and you should too.
Thank you. Thank you.
So is that a measure of success for me? Sure, that would be great. What I really want out of this transaction is to sell enough copies that I'd be invited back to do it again.
Yeah.
And you're being, even though you're frustrated with your publisher, you're being properly published by major New York City publishing houses.
Yeah.
This book goes out into the world. You can actually walk through an airport and find your book. You can't walk through an airport and find mine. So if you're planning to travel, buy one to take with you. But that's what I want out of the deal.
But
I
don't
just
you
want to be
find
asked
that
back to the dance.
The goals change. I mean, I remember when I first got interest from an agent, I went into the city to meet with my agent, and she said to me, where do you see yourself in 5 years as a writer? And I blurted out very honestly, if I could walk into a bookstore and see my name on a book, I could die happy. That was all I wanted. But then I achieved that goal.
It's not enough now.
It's not enough. So then, now I said, now I'll be a real writer if I can get 2 books published, right? So then each time you achieve a goal, sort of the goalpost, moves just a little bit farther.
I guess so. I mean, for
Yeah.
me, the goal right now is to have somebody waiting at the other end of the process to publish the book that I'm working on. Not
Right.
to work on it
Right.
without a net, not knowing
Right.
what's going to happen to it, and then going out with hat in hand
Right.
to these 20 publishers who are going to say, gee, we're sorry, you're too old, you're too this, you're too that. I'd want somebody there waiting for it and happily welcoming it, taking it on.
The process has changed a lot. It used to be, if you were an established author and you wrote one book and you wanted to sell another one, a novel, you would write a proposal.
Right.
You would write a few chapters and an outline, and a publisher would buy that. Except for the biggest New York Times best-selling authors, now you have to write the whole book. For the most part. I mean, there were some exceptions.
Right, that's
But
not true
it's
for
really
nonfiction.
changed.
Like for these ghosty
Yeah.
books I do, the nonfiction books, that's not the case. But for a novel, it's absolutely the case, especially from somebody who's not fully established.
Now, this book, I actually, when I sold Love Sold Separately, this publisher, I signed a 3-book deal. So they originally had wanted 3 Dana Barry books and then changed their mind. So I wrote 2 Dana Barry books. And then they were waiting for me to pitch an idea for book number 3. And I came up with this and I thought, oh my God, they're never going to go for this. And they went for it. So yeah, so I did pitch this one on an idea. And then they sat on me and I had to get it written really, really fast.
And was it all pure pandemic? I mean, the idea and everything came during COVID?
Yep, and I wrote it, I got the idea and I finished writing it during the pandemic and I wrote it pretty quickly. You know, I've become a faster writer, believe it or not. And I've discovered that the benefit of that for me, I don't know if you write quickly, but if I write a novel quickly, I can sort of hold all the moving parts in my head at once and I don't drop anything. And I kind of prefer that. It can make me a little crazy, but I like getting through it quickly.
Yeah, I drop shit every once in a while.
You drop it,
Well,
yeah.
I work on a couple of things
Yeah.
at the same time. So I feel if I set this, like when I had to set this aside, maybe because I had a deadline to meet on
Yeah.
a ghostwriting project, I'd have to get back to speed. I'd have to fully immerse myself
That's a
in it again.
challenge. I'm dealing with that right now because when I got the idea for this, I had already written 200 pages of another book that I didn't think was right for this publisher. So I put that aside and I wrote this, and now I'm trying to get back into that. 200 pages is a lot.
Yeah, you sort of have to, I find you got to start all over again
Yeah.
and write through as though you're editing it
Yeah,
until
yeah.
you feel like you're in the
It's-
rhythm of the piece.
It's hard. It's
Well,
hard.
fast or not, you did a great job here. It's a very long, if you guys are looking for something that feels Long Island-y, this feels a whole lot Long Island-y.
It's very Long
very much
Island
of a
centric.
place, yes.
Yeah.
There's some real Long Island locations in there too, aren't there?
Yeah, I didn't fake it this time. I actually, you know, I have scenes that take place in Trader Joe's in Plainview. I actually brought the book the day before it was published to the Trader Joe's in Plainview and gave a copy to the manager. So I hope it's making the rounds there.
Well, mine has a few Long Island scenes, but I set it in a fictional Long Island and a real Park City. I mean, the Long Island that I used was so fictional that it was called Centerville. It was right in the middle
Right.
of Long Island.
But
So,
you were, what were you picturing a specific town?
you know, I was picturing a mix of Port, of Roslyn, of
Yeah.
Cold Spring Harbor. I
Yeah.
just didn't want it to, you know, I write about, I bug people from my real life and grab at the stuff of their life and attach it to my books in ways I'm not always sure I'm entitled to. So if somebody's going through an ugly divorce, I might seize on a detail or two from that ugly
Right,
divorce
right.
and visit it again through the perspective of a character. So I didn't want to root that part in a specific
Right.
place because I didn't want anybody to see themselves.
Yeah.
Or to have anybody else see themselves.
Yeah,
even if though they
there's a
may.
confession. We do borrow stuff from you people, so be careful what you say around us.
Right,
But yeah, but we do try to disguise it.
right.
Yeah.
So the Long Island pieces, I figured I
Yeah.
would disguise. Nobody knows me in Utah, so I figured that was
Yeah.
fair game.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Other
I have another
questions?
question for
Yes.
both of you. You've been discussing this through this talk, about talking a little bit more about the challenge of being a creative artist, a creator of things, but having to do so in a way that you need to make a career out of it, in terms of how much do you just stay true to yourself and how much do you follow what you know is going to be commercially successful, and finding some sort of balance in between so you don't lose yourself in the process.
You know, I think, and one of the things I tell my students, you can't write to a market. It's impossible. First of all, you know, writing a book is really hard. You have to write the book that you love. Even though I was talking before about how that book that I was originally calling Kitty Kitty Bang Bang, I thought it was going to be my most commercial book. I wasn't writing it because it was going to be, I thought it was going to be commercial. I was writing it because it entertained me at the moment. So writing for a market is a mistake for several reasons. One, by the time the book is finished, you finished writing it, and if you're lucky enough to get it published, it winds its way through the production process, that trend or that market is going to be finished. So it's silly to chase a market. But the other part of it is, if you don't love what you're writing, you're not going to write a good book. You have to really feel passionate about the project. So I do talk about it's like art and commerce mix, but I'm always writing the book I most want to read at that particular moment. What about you?
You know, I try not to think about the end game. I lose myself in the process. And I'm blessed and lucky enough to have another way to make a living as a writer. You know, even though I'm writing for other people, I guess it's writing adjacent. I often think of, that's my version of the struggling actor waiting tables. It's hard to think of myself or sit on a stage here and introduce myself to you guys as a struggling writer. I'm not that, but I'm like that struggling actor who's waiting tables, waiting for that big break, insofar as my novel writing career is concerned. So I do this other writing adjacent piece. But like Ellen, I'm not chasing a market. I wouldn't know how to do that. I'm not wired that way. And if it works out that there's lightning in a bottle and the market finds me, that's great. And if it doesn't, if I can get the opportunity and find those hours between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. or late at night when my kids were little and our house was busy and full, I would write early in the morning or late at night when the house was quiet, and always mindful of the fact that I had to do this other work in order to stay ahead of the bills in our lives and all that kind of stuff. So it's very hard. All artists, I think today, whether you're painting or you're a choreographer or you're a novelist, it's very hard to get noticed and to monetize your passion. And that's kind of the theme at the heart of Balloon Dog, as represented by this silly, iconic balloon dog sculpture, a thing that every party clown can make and toss off without thinking about it. How do we find that opportunity to toss off our own little balloon dogs and make noise on our own behalf? It's elusive, and I've figured out that it's silly to chase it, for me.
Well, as I think we will begin to wrap this up, we have another question over here. Maybe you could, you are both two Long Island authors. Tell us about some other Long Island authors that maybe we know or maybe should know about.
Well, we all know our friend Susan Isaacs, who lives in town, who's in our midst and often shows up here at the library.
And there was a big article on Nelson DeMille in Newsday today. But I know another very funny Long Island writer is my dear friend Sarah Lee Rosenberg. A literary fiction writer on Long Island is Susan Henderson. And I think is Jeannie here? Jeannie Moon, ladies and gentlemen, another Long Island writer is here. So yeah, there are lots of folks out there, wonderful writers here on Long Island.
I've had two guests on my podcast, which the theme is ghostwriting, so I've only been bringing people on who do this collaborative work as well. But George Vesey, who lives here in town, has written some wonderful books as a ghostwriter, including most meaningfully this week, the Loretta Lynn book, Coal Miner's Daughter. She just passed away this week. He lives here in town. And Michael Jan Friedman, who writes these great Star Trek books that I never read, although there's a character named after me in them. He lives here in town. He wrote a book for Hulk Hogan at one point when he was waiting for the Star Trek muse to find him. So there are tons of writers, not just on Long Island, but here in Port. It's a great place to do what we do.
Another.
Sorry to hold up the group if we're nearing the end point. But speaking about influential literary figures, it seems clear to me, Dan, that you're a fan of J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, with your disgust for Hollywood. I myself am a bit of a cinephile. I think I do love movies, and perhaps you love them, but perhaps we both share a love for the novel, and perhaps it's a bit snotty, but see that as the highest form of art. I would love to just hear your thoughts on what makes it. Let's assume I've got that correct, that we are in agreement that it's the highest form of art. Sort of what makes it that. I personally think perhaps it's just the ability to really delve into something and concentrate and see sort of the back and forth of some big idea being played out, right? So like one of my favorite novels is The Princess Casamassima from Henry James, and you see a really a deep political division, but you get both sides of it, and it's just a beautiful novel. And there's sort of a nuance to it, but also this deep ethical thread running through it. So I would just love to hear, what makes the novel sort of at the top of the pyramid, if you agree with that.
Well, I think for me, it's really a two-sided question. What makes the novel for the writer and what makes it for the reader? Because there's two very different experiences. So I'm thinking as a writer, I feel like if I've told the story I wanted to tell in the ways I wanted to tell it, that makes it for me. If readers come along for the ride, that's great. As a reader, I read a lot. When I feel like I'm lost in a world, when I don't want this book to end, when I want to know what happens to the people that I've just spent the last 300-400 pages with, when I find myself weeks, months, or years later remembering a moment, a scene, wondering what's happened to this or that character or how that world might have changed, to me, that's what signals a novel that has made it. I don't often feel that way when I leave a movie, even a wonderful movie. Now, of course, that changes over time based on the perspectives that I bring to it. One of the most meaningful novels I read as a kid, and I read it time and time again, was The Sun Also Rises. I read it in high school, I read it in college, I've read it probably every decade since. I haven't gone back to it for a couple of decades, but my wife and I just listened to the audiobook version, and I got to tell you, we didn't finish it. So we were at a different place in our lives, and that book didn't speak into my experience in the same way it did when I was 20, 30, and 40 years old. So the needle changes, and I think we have to change with it. But to me, the novel, as opposed to film, and then I'll let Ellen tackle that question, is it all lives here in your imagination. It's the movie we can imagine in our minds. And I think a book can do that better than any special effect, than any brilliant casting choice, than any clever turn of catchphrase that seeps into the culture off of the big screen. To me, I find that the reading experience allows the story to resonate in a much deeper, more fundamental way.
I don't know that I can top that answer. I mean, if I read a book and the characters come alive and the story speaks to me and I'm getting insights into the relationships between human beings and what it means to be a human being and what it means to be interacting with friends, with family, to live in this world, if I read something that makes me feel less alone in this world, that gives insights that make give you that moment of, yes, that moment of recognition. And that's the kind of thing that stays with me. And I think that's what makes a great book. It's very hard to define. It's sort of like this special alchemy that happens. And, I think if any book that speaks to you, you never have to apologize for it being a favorite book, for you finding it beautiful or meaningful or just funny and enjoyable. Any way that it speaks to you, it speaks to you. So.
The catchphrase, the book was better, right?
Yeah.
You've seen the movie, you have to tell everybody that the book was clearly better, and you should go read the book.
Right.
When people read my books, they say the book is so good there shouldn't be a movie. Don't even bother.
Well, I have to thank you both. This has been really terrific. Let's have a round of applause.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
We're glad the Mets stayed off of that 4 o'clock start, which was looming as a potential, which would have sort of killed our attendance here today.
And if you haven't read Balloon Dog, please, it is so smart and so funny and so engaging. I can't recommend it highly enough. I love the book.
Well, thank you.
We happen to have copies for sale
Yes.
right in the back here, so
Read Alan's book.
Yeah.
It is good.
Please
Thank you guys
stop
for
by
coming.
the back. The authors will be back there shortly to sign books. Thank you all for coming out today. Thanks to those of you joining us on Zoom today. Thank you guys once again. This was so terrific.
Thank you for having us.